Hello, everybody, and hello to all our followers on the World Mizrachi program and from the Bernie News Network. Welcome, everyone, to our BNN live interview in collaboration with World Mizrachi. And thank you to everyone who is tuned in live with us today. Today, we are very proud to present to you our episode, Behind the Frame, One Photographer's Journey Through Israel's Darkest Hours. I'm Ellen Johnson-Hyam from Bernie News Network, and I am so pleased today to be joined by Israeli-American photojournalist Shanie Roth. At the end of today's conversation, we will be doing a live Q&A, so please put your questions in the chat box below. And I'd also like to welcome our viewers from the World Mizrachi program here in Israel and also across the diaspora. So let's begin by introducing the incredible Shanie Roth. Shanie was born and raised in San Francisco, California, and was back and forth to Israel throughout her life before moving to Tel Aviv to complete her bachelor's degree. Today, most of Shanie's time is dedicated to her photojournalism, which is why we're speaking with her today. Since October 7th, Shanie has dedicated herself to advocacy for bringing the hostages home on the international stage. Her photography has been published in international publications, and she uses her social media accounts to humanize Israelis in the eyes of an unforgiving world. Shanie has been behind the camera, center stage, photographing some of the most powerful moments in the hostage family communities, rallies, and movements. From photographing hostage mothers during some of the most powerful of moments to being front and center during hostage releases here in Tel Aviv, Shanie has been photographing Israeli society's most powerful moments since October 7th, 2023. So welcome, Shanie. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm doing well and really grateful that you're creating space for these important conversations.
So, Shanie, you were at Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, in central Tel Aviv, last Saturday to photograph the reactions of the hostage families and the Israeli public as they watched on what could only be described as one of the most shocking hostage releases that we've seen in the last few months, where we saw Ohad Ben-Ami, Or Levi, and Eli Sharabi return home to Israeli soil. Could you walk us through the mood and the feeling of last week in the hostage family community and the Israeli public discourse from what you saw?
Definitely. I think it's important, especially if we have listeners who have not been in Israel since October 7th, to set the scene. Hostage Square is across the street from the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv and is right in front of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. The space used to be sort of a blank slate, cement square in between this duality of artwork and war and like creativity and reality. And when the war started, the hostage families decided on this location for a very strategic reason. It's in front of the IDF headquarters where all the decision makers were based, especially in the beginning of the war. And also it is in the heart of the country in Tel Aviv. And the location has become this sort of hub of emotions for the Israeli public. And I think that's a really important note about the Hostage Square just as a location, because Israelis as a society are very tough, very resilient for good and for bad, but often that comes off as like less emotional. And since the start of the war, Hostage Square has really been the one consistent place where Israelis as a collective have let themselves feel. Now, the emotions have changed a lot through the war, but the one consistent aspect of Hostage Square, which I think is extremely important for the community and society as a whole, is this like ability to feel, right? Like people have sort of created a war routine. They go to work day to day. Life has to continue, but when you come to Hostage Square, you know that you're going to be around like-minded people who are also open to having like an emotional experience. So I think that mindset, especially as we're talking about all of these photos and the hostages in general, it's really important to keep in mind for the listener so that they are able to kind of put themselves in the location of the subjects of the photos. Now, in the last few weeks since the hostage deal started, it was really the first time I saw joy in the square since the war started. And I've had a lot of feedback on the photos in the past few weeks where people from all over the world will comment or message me and say, "Wow, this is the first time I've seen someone smile in this location." And it's such a like positive and relieving thing to see. And last week was not the case. That was not the case in Hostage Square. The release was delayed by about an hour. And as kind of time progressed, the crowd grew. In the last few weeks, there have been a few hundred to a few thousand people at Hostage Square to watch these releases. And usually between Saturday morning to Saturday afternoon, it's not always consistent. This one was delayed, and there was you could feel the tension in Hostage Square. There was also like the potential, and people thought that because they were men, they potentially were under, I don't even know if you can say tougher conditions, but there were reports that were very concerning at this release, and they were true, which was really tough to see. And the emotions in Hostage Square, which again is this like hub where Israelis are allowing themselves to feel all of these things, were really torn between relief that finally these three men were home, shock at how they looked, and extreme concern for all of the remaining hostages. The images that came out of the release elicited, I think, memories of the Holocaust. There were a lot of comparisons being made to how the released hostages looked compared to victims of the Holocaust and concentration camp survivors. And the complicated emotions of that elicited a very different reaction in Hostage Square to the other releases. There was a lot of grief and agony on Saturday.
And we'll come on to that later about the contrasting emotions that you've seen, because obviously there have been so many different events that have taken place specifically at Hostage Square and, across central Israel that sort of rally around the hostage forum and rally around the hostage families. And last Saturday was a particularly poignant moment. But I would like to roll back a little bit to the start of the war, since October 7th, the beginning of this story in 2020. Shanie, what empowered you to begin focusing in on the hostages and their stories and to really capture this particular narrative in the country?
Of course. On October 7th, I was actually on a flight from California to Tel Aviv that left October 6th in the evening, California time. We actually took off 10 minutes before everything started in Israel. And right as we were, in the air, I got a text from my mom that says there's sirens in Tel Aviv. But I had a 15-hour flight ahead of me, and there was not much I could do. As the flight progressed, I was connected to Wi-Fi on the plane and started getting information of what was going on in Israel. Eventually, the Wi-Fi cut out. We were told that we were turning back to California instead of continuing after 7 hours, and then eventually reconnected to internet once we were over Canada. And the first thing I did was open Instagram, and the first video I saw of what was going on in Israel was of Naama Levy being kidnapped into Gaza. I mean, that video has become sort of iconic of October 7th and the war after. And I think most people who care about this issue can bring up the imagery of that. And it was extremely shocking to see, especially on an airplane, where there was no other information that I could easily access. And that shock is really what propelled me to start this work. I wasn't able to get back to Israel for about a month after because of the lack of flights. But while I was in California, I started doing some advocacy interviews on what was going on, met some politicians about the issue, and in tandem was also faced with significant anti-Semitism from my peers in California. I grew up in San Francisco and was surrounded by a very American liberal youth crowd who I often aligned with in my views and perspectives on life. But after October 7th, that completely changed. There were friends of mine from high school who posted detailed explanations as to why resistance should be supported and encouraged, and that they're inspired by the resistance that they saw on October 7th. And both of those things together is really what pushed me to never stop talking about the hostages. In my opinion, it should not be a political issue. It's a humanitarian issue, and these are mostly civilians from all over the world who were kidnapped and are still being held, and I will not stop talking about them until they're all home.
And I think it's extremely poignant because the story of the hostages can often that there might be months within the Jewish and the Israeli community. There might be months where it's more prevalent, it's more reported on. That there have been months where weeks have gone by and you feel like the world is silent, or you feel like no one is there for these hostage families, or people don't resonate as much with the story. But when we look at some of these photos, like we showed at the beginning, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands, gathering together to show solidarity, to show support with the hostage families. And that's what it's about. It's about support. We know that there are a lot of different emotions that come into play. You've mentioned last Saturday, you saw grief, anxiety, fear with one of the most difficult releases that we have seen, tremendous pain from Israeli society and Israeli public. We've also seen joy. We've seen relief, we've seen happiness, and we also see a lot of anger. Can you talk about the different emotions? Walk us through a couple of events that take place in Hostage Square, whether it be a hostage release. I know that when the four girls were released a couple of weeks ago, we saw quite a lot of happiness. We saw a lot of joy, although Agam wasn't released with the other four as observers from Nahal Oz. We did see quite a lot of happiness, faith, and passion come into play. But can you just walk us through what it's like as the communities mobilize together, the emotions that you see, and paint that picture for us?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with a different event that hit me particularly hard. It was last January, Kfir Bibas's first birthday, and his first birthday in captivity. He's now had two. The hostage families often, a lot of them have Instagram accounts for their family members who are being held captive. And at the beginning of the war, I followed a lot of them and was in communication with the family members or individuals running those accounts
I think we
to
can
see
pull
how I
up
could
one of
help.
these photos. Yeah.
Yeah, it is one of them. You can, yeah, that one. But the one of his birthday is a few more, I think. That event was during the day, and there were a lot of children there. And it hit me particularly hard because often these really tough topics are kept away from kids, right? It's really hard to explain to a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old what a hostage even is or why hostages were taken. But the reality of Israeli society is that these kids have to know what's going on because it's happening all around, and often they are aware, or they know someone who has been directly affected by this issue. And my experience seeing those children like playing with orange balloons on Kfir Bibas's first birthday depicted this dichotomy in a very extreme and kind of nuanced way, because these children were continuing to live their lives and they were playing with orange balloons at Hostage Square while someone younger than them was being held hostage, and they were also aware of that reality because they were being talked to about it, and we were singing happy birthday. And that dichotomy is particularly interesting to me about Hostage Square as the location, again, for all emotions to be welcomed. As time progressed, the rallies in Hostage Square became much more agonizing. You could feel the hope wavering from the Israeli public that was attending these rallies regularly. And the crowds also started to diminish because it felt like it wasn't making a difference, I think, to a lot of people. Also, the hostages, even in the Israeli psyche, I think became sort of normalized. The idea that there were 200 or 150 hostages just became a fact of life. And that was never acceptable to me, which is why I continue to go every week. And the birthdays are particular moments that come to mind as very emotional, like Naama Levi's 20th birthday, which there was a photo of her mother earlier. Those types of events usually brought out larger crowds as well, which is interesting. It changed the dynamic of like the normal day to day and like the normal fact there were hostages to, oh, this is an event that we should go and support, or it brought up the memory again. As again time progressed, the rallies became more agonizing, more hostages were declared dead. Those were always really hard weeks. The weeks where there was a sign of life from a hostage always brought out a very large emotional crowd, particularly Dan Alexander's video. More recently is a rally that I will never forget. There were like men in their fees crying, women, teenagers, everyone was so emotional at that event. And then there's the opposite experience of being in Hostage Square when the first girls, Romy and Emily, were released, and Doron. And then the observers, and the complete relief and the tears of joy that were streaming down people's faces. And I was listening to conversations between observers at Hostage Square, because that's what I do. Usually it leads me to better photos when I try to understand what people are thinking and feeling. And the discussion always held to the truth of relief and joy and the regaining of hope, is what it felt like when these girls were released, but also the extreme worry that there were still so many Israelis there. And what about the babies? And what about this person? And what about my family member? And that duality will continue to exist until they all come.
And you touched on mothers, young men, older men, teenagers. The demographic really shifts because you're really seeing an entire society, as we said, come together for valuing human life, Israeli, Jewish human life, which is really, really important. I think what's been really, really interesting that we've seen with a lot of the photography, which is why photojournalism and your work is so important, is that it helps to form the entire narrative and also the conflicting narrative of the conflict from a sort of political sense, which we won't get into in terms of detail. When the releases are taking place, there is a large screen in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv that is live streaming the release of innocent Israeli civilians who have been held captive for a very long time, and obviously varying degrees of time depending on when the releases take place. And there is such a humanizing element of Israeli society during these releases in particular. Is it surreal for you to be photographing the public watching something so inhumane take place, but also they're celebrating it because they're finally home, but the way in which they are captured is so cruel? How does it feel for you that you're photographing a moment that we could never even imagine that we're living through?
It's really complicated, especially because I identify with all of these people as well. I feel that I know all of them so well, even though I haven't met any of them, because so much of the last year and a half of my life has been dedicated to this work. So I feel a very personal connection with all of the releases and also with all of the individuals at these rallies. There are a lot of people that I recognize that come every week. And the way I think about it is that the goal with my photos is not to make the case for a specific political issue. It is to present the viewer of my photos with facts. And that, I think, is the power of photojournalism, especially in conflict zones in general, is when you see someone's eyes, it's really hard to deny that they're a human being and that they have a soul. And a really important part of my work has been humanizing the Israeli narrative throughout this conflict. And one of the most important ways I can do that is by focusing on the individuals and what they're experiencing at Hostage Square. So while I also am very emotional about these releases, I try to put my feelings to the side and focus on what's in front of me and how I can present the reality the most accurately to the viewers of my photos.
Let's also zoom in a little bit as well, figure of speech, to the parents and the families. We hear so much about the families, and it is so interesting to see how each family of the hostages have formed collective unity together, have really mobilized in such a professional, distinguished way. They have become, the wrong word to use is icons of a movement, because it sounds like a celebrity term, but they have become leaders in their own right. You photographed a lot of the mothers. You talked about Naama's mother. There was a beautiful photo that we showed at the beginning of Rachel Hirsch's mother, Rachel Goldberg-Polin. Can you talk about what you see in the mothers and the fathers who are really sort of spearheading this movement and speaking on behalf of their children, and what you see in their faces, and just walk me through that a little bit?
I've listened to a lot of interviews with Rachel Goldberg-Polin discuss this, and she always says that she never liked the spotlight, never thought of herself as someone who could speak in front of thousands of people, but that she doesn't see another option. And specifically with the Goldberg-Polins, they're continuing to do this hostage advocacy, even though they received horrific news and had pretty much the worst outcome possible from this situation. And there's a really interesting dynamic with the mothers and the fathers as well, but I have paid specific attention to the mothers in this case, where because they don't see another option, they really go to the other extreme and do everything in their power and almost become robotic in order to continue living and continue doing this advocacy. And in different interviews that you hear with them, that they will comment on that as well, how they've had to put the hell that they're going through, sort of compartmentalize it in order to be able to do the advocacy work and, even wake up in the morning. So, telling the mothers' stories and the fathers and the family members in general has been particularly important to me because they often feel very alone in this work. And they're the ones that have to constantly live with the reality of a family member being a hostage. And all of us, even in Israel, as connected as we feel, if it's not our direct family member, it is somewhat easier to disconnect, and it's not doesn't have to be the constant theme of our lives if we don't choose to make it that way. They don't have a choice. And my work is to give them more of a voice, whether that's directly volunteering with the Goldberg-Polins, which I did a few times, to going to rallies and photographing like Naama Levi's birthday or other events that the families do. There's a hostage named Evyatar whose family hosts a music circle every week on Thursdays. Each family has their own way of advocacy, and a lot of it reflects the values and things that were important to their family member. And that's really what I'm trying to focus on, the individuality of each of those family members as well, but also of the hostage, and trying to bring as much attention to it as possible. Because as you said, it's not always at the biggest headline or at the top of the news story, especially internationally. But this is still an international crisis, not just one for Israelis to deal with.
For sure. Social media is obviously something that automatically, as young people, comes into play with this war, and with all humanitarian issues in general. Social media is at the forefront. And obviously, the Jewish people are trying their absolute best to be able to amplify voices and to be able to say, this is going on to us. Can the world pay attention, even just for a few minutes? Social media is really one of the main tools that people use. And I know that you, as a photojournalist, is having to use social media to amplify those stories. How has social media and photography had to come together in the way that we understand these events? How are you using it yourself to showcase your work and to engage with the public and show them, this is what's going on, and I've got photographs to prove it, to show it?
Yeah, I think this touches on a small point I made earlier, which is that I see my mission as being a conveyor of a specific truth, the truth that I'm experiencing and that my subjects are experiencing. Photos are really hard to argue with because they are just a fact, not like an infographic that some account may have created that sort of romanticizes a specific situation. So, the way I've approached using social media is really sticking to the photos and letting the photos tell the story of the individuals um, that are experiencing hell. In high school, I listened to a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie in one of my history classes called The Danger of a Single Story. And she discusses how humans have a tendency to group communities or countries under a one narrative because it makes it easier for people who are not part of that community to understand it. And she discusses how dangerous this is in terms of her own life experience, but what I have tried to do throughout my work, and she has put into words in a very eloquent way something that I've really lived my life by since I was quite young, is to give voice to the individual story, to not have one single story, even among hostage families or even among the Israelis attending these rallies. Each person is experiencing it in their own way. And I see my role as showing the world and my followers in this case how the specific individual that I'm photographing is experiencing that moment. You know, photos are not diplomats. They don't negotiate, they don't do a lot of like talking or politics or diplomacy. They really just present people with facts. And I think my job in this role as a photographer and advocate for the hostage families is to make the world uncomfortable that this continues to be a reality. And so I hope my goal is to make people feel, to elicit emotion, because so many of us have become sort of apathetic to this situation, but also to make people uncomfortable and to show the reality of what people are going through. And yes, seeing, an old man cry maybe will make someone uncomfortable, and that's the goal. And it's interesting because social media has become this sort of weird tool to convey this message to a very broad audience. My Instagram account does not have that many followers, but I can see the reach. And in the last, like I checked before we started talking, in the last month, the account has reached over 17,000 people. And in the last 3 months, it's reached almost 40,000 people. So, my lesson from that, and the lesson I hope that people who are listening take home, is that even if it doesn't feel like you're having a big impact on people around you, you don't always know who's listening and who's watching and who's talking about what you're doing. And they don't need to directly comment or like a post or even say in person to you that they appreciate your work for you to have an impact. And that's been a really powerful tool for me because it has propelled what I'm doing and continues to encourage me to continue this work because I can see that a lot of people are engaging with it.
And that's amazing to know that, your photos are reaching so many people and that the message is coming across. I would love to just pull up. We only got a short glimpse of some photos we did flick through briefly, but I would just love you to just tell us what you want our audience and whoever's watching this and whoever tunes in after, what you want people to know about Israelis, about Jews when they look at when they look at these photos. And if you just want to walk through, each photo is gonna flick through pretty quickly, but just sort of walk me through what you want people to know, and feel free to talk about some of these photos here as well.
And the most important thing, I think, when you interact with anybody, not just Israelis, is to have empathy. And I have felt a significant lack of empathy for Israelis specifically throughout this war. And what I hope that my photos create is that they create space to feel empathy for a people who are in a lot of pain. I don't try to make my photos political. They really are just to convey a message of pain and anguish. I like this one specifically with the tear going down this young girl's face. And also the fact that each Israeli, just like anyone else, has different opinions over what should be done in this war, and also with the hostages, and in every aspect of life, right? No one completely agrees with each other. And that's also one of my big messages that I want to convey to the world, that within Israel, there's constant dialogue over what's going on in the war and how the best way to bring the hostages home. And people don't always agree. But what I hope to create is the space to have the conversation and to create the understanding that not everyone is agreeing.
And I think we're going to open up to the chat box in a minute. Actually, we'll open up to it now and find out what some of our listeners are saying. But I think one of the questions that was submitted a little earlier was, and it leads on to exactly what you were saying just before. Have there been any moments, we talk a lot about unity, and I think it's something that's been emerging in the discourse to do with the hostages and the hostage families. It's something that people are trying to cling on to, is this word unity. It's an interesting word. During your photography, have you noticed moments of unity? We can see in these photos different sects of society, different demographics coming together for one cause. We see men wearing kippah and davening in Hostage Square and coming together. And we see people who in the middle of Shabbat are walking down and watching things on television. So there is clearly different discourse going on and different people coming together. What kind of unity are you seeing when you're taking your photos and when you're in attendance?
I see the unity of the Israeli people. When I attend these rallies and the releases, just like you said, they're people from all across the country. Not all of them are Jewish. Not all of them were born in Israel. There are a lot of internationals who come, but in my perspective, that just encapsulates the Israeli experience and the Israeli people. Now, my focus is often on the individual because I really try to differentiate each person and each person's experience. And the word unity is interesting because if anyone follows the news in Israeli society, even the word unity is controversial these days. But as I said in the beginning, I think Hostage Square is the one place in Israel where people allow themselves to feel unified and to experience whatever emotions they're feeling without judgment and just allow themselves to feel. It's a really uncommon thing in Israeli society. You don't see people like walking down the street crying often in Israel, but you do see that in Hostage Square. And I think the location of Hostage Square encapsulates the word unity very well because it just is not a judgmental place, and it's a place that actually creates the space for everyone.
And we've had someone submit a question here that says, have you been able to form a close bond or connection with any particular families or representatives or volunteers in the community through your photography work? Or have you connected closely with a particular story? And it's not to say that the other stories are diminished. Is there something that you have connected quite closely to through your work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Each person has sort of connected to specific hostage stories a little more than others, which is a very interesting reality that we have contended with here. I can mention a few. As I said before, I feel like they're all members of my family, and I think a lot of Israelis would agree with that statement. I particularly connected with the Goldberg Polans, as I think many people have, but I worked quite closely with them a few times. In December of 2023, Hirsch was supposed to leave on his big trip to India, and a few days before the date that he was supposed to leave, I messaged his Instagram account telling them like if they ever need a photographer, I'm happy to help. And they responded to me saying that they are doing an event at the Ben Gurion airport a few days later on the day of his trip, and if I could come. And I met his whole family there. A lot of his younger sister's peers came, and the flight he was supposed to be on was an El Al flight to India. They made this announcement on the plane when they were flying, and that was a very impactful experience. Hirsch was also born in Berkeley, which is across the water from San Francisco. So there was kind of a immediate connection in that sense. And I identified a lot with his sisters who are around my age. Another one is Naama Levy. Watching her release was particularly emotional for me. As I said before, hers was the first video that I saw coming out of the South on October 7th. And the kind of became an icon and an explainer for why Israelis should be allowed to be in pain after what happened, which is another important part of my work. I want to show the world that we are allowed to be in pain as well, that it doesn't take away from anybody else's pain, but that the Israeli society is in very deep pain. And sometimes I feel like that has to be proved, which is a horrible reality, but it is the reality we're contending with. Naama Levy's story particularly touched me. I also visited a lot of the kibbutzim and other communities in the South on different delegations as a photographer, and I saw the Bibas house. I was in Kfar Aza and took photos of Emily Damari's house, and there are very confusing emotions when you're there because you're witnessing someone's safe space that was so brutally violated, and it sort of becomes a museum, which is kind of a longer conversation, but it is an interesting dynamic. But of course, like once you've been in someone's home, it hits you particularly hard, whether or not they've been released and when different things come up about them.
And thank you for that. I think it's interesting because some of the people that you're mentioning, Nama, Emily, these are people that are lucky enough to be able to return to these homes. And of course, there are still visitors and delegations and photographers like yourself who are still photographing these moments. And such contrasting feelings are everywhere. My final question in the chat box is, has there ever been a moment where you've had to step away because it's too overwhelming? You're literally photographing almost every release, every rally, most events that are taking place, or sort of related, how do you process the emotions of what you see behind the camera? You're obviously having to digest these photos into a catalogue, a digital catalogue, and having to go through it. How do you process that?
It's a hard question because I don't think I have a full answer yet because the crisis is still ongoing. So I'll have to give you a more comprehensive answer once all the hostages are home. But one moment where I did need to pull away was after the 6 hostages, including Hirsch, were found murdered in the tunnel. That was one of the first times I really cried after the war started, which was an interesting experience because I felt quite numb for a lot of it. In order to continue doing this work, you have to detach a little bit from the emotional experience because it's so intense and so intense regularly, right? You don't ever really get a break. And the people who get a break are the lucky ones because the families are really the ones who never get a break. So that moment was particularly hard for me. And I did go to a few of the rallies and protests that were connected to it, but needed to really take time after all of them to kind of understand and contend with the reality that was really difficult for me to come to terms with. And I think difficult for a lot of people because, especially as we talked about, I mean, Rachel became such a like lioness and leader, and so many people hoped so desperately for a different outcome for her family. And the tragedy and the reality was that it didn't happen. And I think there was a lot of like coming to terms with that fact that was hard for me.
That I would like to say that I can move on to the actual final question, but we have a couple more questions coming through, and I'll just pick one last one for you, Shanie. And obviously, everything is just so insightful and so helpful for all our listeners to be able to delve into this world. Hopefully, this crisis is going to be resolved very soon. The dream and what everyone is pushing for is that every single hostage is going to be able to come home, and finally the Israeli and Jewish society can begin to heal, begin to have relief, and the hope can come to fruition. When the hostage crisis reaches a resolution, hopefully through a successful deal. How will you navigate the next phase of your advocacy? And that sort of is the final question, is what are the hopes and dreams for you moving forward with this work? You obviously want people to continue looking at these powerful images. What's the next steps for you?
It's a good question. It's hard to focus on because you have to sort of be in the moment in Israel when things are changing all the time. So it's become hard to plan for like long-term things like that. But one of the biggest lessons, as I talked about before, that I have gained from this experience is that even if it doesn't feel like what you're doing is having a big impact, often the unspoken power of what you're doing is actually reaching a lot more people. And that I hope to continue doing and expand in different directions, whether it's maybe publishing a book that has these photos, doing some type of exhibition. And one of my like true loves is traveling and getting to know different types of people. And before the war, that was what my focus was as a photographer. It was traveling to a bunch of different countries. I've been in Morocco and Turkey and all over Europe and Southeast Asia and Mexico. And I love meeting different types of people and just getting to know them and telling their stories, especially, and even though it's not as intense as what's going on here right now. So I hope to continue doing that as well. And the hostage story is never going to end here, because even when they do come home, and hopefully they all will come home, this is a crisis, a multi-generational crisis for the Israeli people and for the Jewish people and for everyone who was held hostage. And not all of them are Jewish and not all of them are Israeli. That will be a lifelong struggle for anyone that cares deeply about this problem, because the healing from this issue is not going to be overnight. And you can see that now as hostages are coming out, and there's euphoria in the moment, which is a completely natural and physical reaction. And then you even hear Israeli doctors talking about the deterioration of their condition a few days later, and how they come back with very complicated trauma and physical issues. And I see one of my missions now, I think for the rest of my life, will really be to continue discussing this problem and to working towards finding a solution in terms of like mental health care and physical health care, and also for the Israeli people, because we were all sort of taken hostage by this war and are still living in a war mentality, even with the ceasefire. And I think there will be a lot of healing that will need to happen in Israel. Part of my BA is in psychology, and I've worked in different startups, some in healthcare, and I really hope to be able to kind of fuse the photography and kind of photojournalism aspect of my life, and also this more like technical and business aspect of my life together to create some type of longer term healing solution for everyone.
And you make, such a powerful point in that this is going to be something that is going to be multi-generational. And we know what happened many years back during the Holocaust, and we're still today talking about it, and will for many generations to come. And here we are in 2025 going through this, and this is a story that won't end. We will continue telling these stories. We will continue our advocacy, and hopefully your photojournalism is going to continue and thrive. And thank you so much, Shanie, for your incredible work. Before everyone goes, I want everyone to be able to follow you, to follow this work, to delve into these photos, to be able to log in on a Sunday morning into Instagram, and to be able to look at the photos you have taken the night before or what you're going to be taking the next day. Can you tell everyone how they can follow you, your Instagram handle, your website? How can people look at more of these photos? There are so many more for everyone to see.
Yes, thank you for that. My website is my name, shanieroth.com, ShanieRoth.com. My Instagram account, which is really if you want to get updated on the day-to-day photos, is where you should follow. It's Shanie Roth Photography. Again, ShanieRoth photography. And please come join. I respond to all of my messages. Feel free to interact. And I would love to hear what people think of my photos, and happy to take any suggestions. If you ever hear of events going on, please let me know, and I would be happy to participate.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today, and we really hope that everyone has a very, very good week ahead, and we should only hear good news. And Shanie, thank you so much again for your incredible photojournalism, and everyone continue to follow Burning News Network for our updates, and thank you to World Mizrachi for our collaboration for this event and for all of our future events. Please do stay updated for events that will be coming in the next couple of weeks or so, and future events that will be developing over the next few months. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Shanie.